Hi, I'm Amara, and for most of my life I was the kind of woman who trusted only what she could measure, count, and hold in her hands, the kind who believed that money came strictly from long hours, tired eyes, and constant worry, never from whispers, symbols, or sacred corners. So when I say that a single rainy evening quietly cracked open the door to everything I thought I knew about abundance, I mean it in the deepest possible way, because that night began like any other, with me sitting at my small kitchen table, bills spread out like an accusation, my phone glowing beside a half-empty mug of cold tea, and my heart feeling heavier than my bank account, the rain tapping on the windows as if it were keeping time with my anxious thoughts. And I remember thinking that I was doing everything right, yet somehow still falling behind, still chasing, still waiting, still hoping that something, anything, would shift, when my thumb mindlessly scrolled and landed on a faded post buried deep in an old discussion forum, written in uneven sentences by someone whose name I no longer remember, but whose words seemed to lean out of the screen and look directly at me, telling a simple story about salt, about a sacred place in the home, and about money flowing in quiet, unexpected ways. And I almost laughed out loud because the idea sounded so small compared to the size of my worries, so fragile compared to the weight of my fear. Yet there was something in the way it was written, soft, calm, certain, that made my chest tighten and my breath slow, as if my body recognized a truth before my mind could argue it away. And I sat there rereading it, my finger hovering above the screen, feeling torn between skepticism and a strange, gentle curiosity that felt like a hand reaching for mine in the dark. And suddenly I noticed how tired I was of pushing, of forcing, of living in a constant state of financial panic, and how badly I wanted a sign, even a small one, that the universe hadn't forgotten me, that maybe there were doors I hadn't tried to open yet, doors that didn't require another sleepless night or another tear-soaked budgeting session. And as the rain grew heavier and the room filled with that quiet, reflective stillness that only comes late at night, I felt a subtle pull toward the corner of my living room, the one spot that always caught the first light of morning, the place where I sometimes stood without knowing why, just breathing, as if my spirit naturally drifted there when it needed peace. And I realized that maybe this was what the post meant by a sacred place, not something labeled or obvious, but something felt, something chosen by instinct rather than logic. And for a moment, I just sat there holding my phone, listening to the rain, feeling my heart beat steadily in my chest, aware that I was standing at a quiet crossroads between what I had always believed and what I was about to try, aware that if I followed this strange little suggestion, something inside me would shift even before anything outside did, and that perhaps this was not just about money at all, but about trust, about hope, about daring to believe that my home, my hands, and my intentions could work together to invite a different future into my life, a future that was already beginning to whisper to me in the soft rhythm of the rain. I kept thinking about that post long after I put my phone down, as if its words had settled somewhere deep in my chest and refused to be ignored. And the next morning I woke up with an unfamiliar sense of curiosity quietly humming beneath my usual worries, the kind of feeling that doesn't shout but gently nudges. And while brushing my teeth, I caught myself staring at my reflection, wondering when I had last allowed myself to believe in anything that wasn't written in a contract or printed on a bank statement, and that simple thought alone felt strange and tender, because it reminded me of a softer version of myself I had almost forgotten, the one who used to believe in lucky charms and whispered wishes. And as I moved through my morning routine, the idea of salt kept returning to me in the most ordinary moments. When I reached for the shaker while cooking, when I passed the small grocery store on the corner, when I noticed the pale crystals scattered on the sidewalk after the city had tried to melt away last night's rain. And by the time I finally stepped outside, it no longer felt like a silly notion, but like an invitation I was quietly being asked to accept. So instead of heading straight to work, I found myself detouring into that little grocery store, my steps feeling both hesitant and oddly determined, the bell above the door chiming softly as if acknowledging my decision. And I walked through the narrow aisles with a strange sense of purpose, eventually stopping in front of a shelf lined with bags and jars of salt, some coarse, some fine, some pink, some white, each one suddenly seeming far more significant than it ever had before. And I stood there longer than necessary, comparing labels, running my fingers over the smooth packaging, wondering which one felt right, and realizing that for the first time in a long while, I wasn't rushing, I wasn't calculating, I wasn't worried about time, I was simply listening. And when I finally picked up a small glass jar of pure white sea salt, it felt less like a purchase and more like a quiet promise, and I held it close to my chest as I paid, feeling a strange flutter of anticipation that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with possibility. And on my way out, I caught my reflection in the shop window again, noticing a softness in my eyes that hadn't been there the night before, as if something inside me had gently loosened its grip on fear. And as I walked down the street, the jar tucked safely in my bag, I realized that this tiny simple act had already begun to change me, because for the first time in a very long time, I was allowing myself to believe that my life might be shaped not only by effort and struggle, but also by intention, by energy, by small sacred rituals that whispered instead of shouted. And that thought followed me all the way home, quietly settling into my heart, where it waited, patient and calm, for what I would do next. When I got home, the first thing I did was wander through my apartment, my eyes tracing the familiar corners I had ignored for months. Corners cluttered with old receipts, dust bunnies, forgotten books, and the weight of unspoken stress. And I realized that if this little ritual was going to mean anything, I needed to start with a clean slate, not just outside, but inside too. The kind of clearing that feels almost like breathing for the first time after holding your breath too long. I started with the living room, pushing aside magazines and empty coffee mugs, wiping the surfaces until they gleamed faintly in the afternoon light. And when I reached the corner that had called to me the night before, the one kissed by morning sun, I crouched down and ran my hands over the floor, feeling the texture of the wood beneath my palms, noticing the dust and smudges I had never really seen before, and as I cleaned, I whispered a small apology to the space for neglecting it, a silly little acknowledgement that somehow made me feel lighter, as if the corner itself was listening. I decided to bring in a candle, something simple, white, not fancy, just a flame I could focus on while placing the salt, and I lit it, watching the soft flicker dance across the walls, casting shadows that seemed to breathe with me. Then I opened the jar of salt, the scent faint but bracing, and poured a small handful into a tiny bowl, marveling at the way the crystals reflected the light, tiny prisms of possibility. Before placing it in the corner, I took a deep breath and whispered aloud the intentions I wanted this ritual to carry: not just money, but stability, confidence, and the feeling of abundance that had always eluded me. Saying it out loud felt strange, almost vulnerable, but also strangely liberating, like stepping onto a stage I had been too afraid to enter. And I noticed that the tension in my shoulders eased, that my chest lifted slightly, as if my body was responding to the act of speaking hope into the universe. I placed the bowl carefully in the corner, adjusting its position until it caught the first rays of morning sunlight just right, the kind of light that makes everything look golden and alive. And I felt a shiver of something unnameable, a tiny thrill that traveled down my spine and settled warmly in my stomach. I stepped back and studied the corner, suddenly aware of how alive my apartment felt, how much energy seemed to shift when attention and intention were applied with care. I even moved a small plant nearby, adjusting it so that its leaves reached toward the salt, and I imagined it drinking in the same energy I was trying to cultivate. Then I stood quietly for a long time, watching the candle flicker, feeling the room breathe with me, and realized that preparing this space was as much about me as it was about the salt. Every sweep of the cloth, every whispered word, every careful placement was a small act of devotion to myself, a promise that I would pay attention, that I would nurture my intentions, that I would trust the process. And as I finally sat down on the couch, exhausted and exhilarated, I understood that this ritual, small, simple, sacred, was already beginning to change the way I moved through my own home, the way I moved through my own life, even before I could see any outward sign of it. At first, nothing happened. The salt sat in its corner quiet and unassuming, and I found myself glancing at it more often than I would care to admit, half expecting a miracle to appear overnight, half afraid I had simply tricked myself into believing in superstition. Days passed, and I went about my routines, still paying bills, still juggling deadlines, still worrying about money. But there was a subtle shift in the way I moved through the apartment, a lightness I couldn't quite name. I noticed that my mornings started with a moment of acknowledgement toward that corner, a breath, a glance, a small whisper of hope before the day's chaos took over. And it was during one of these quiet moments that I realized the world had started to respond in ways that were almost imperceptible but undeniably present. It began with small gestures. A client I hadn't spoken to in months suddenly emailed me about an unexpected opportunity, one that paid more than I had anticipated and required only a few hours of work. At first, I brushed it off as coincidence, the universe playing a gentle trick. But when another email arrived the next day, a friend reaching out about a project she thought I would enjoy, I paused, my heart catching, realizing that the stream of possibilities was starting to trickle in. Soft at first, like the early patter of rain against the window. Each little event made me feel seen, noticed, as if my intentions had quietly set a chain reaction in motion. Even my daily interactions shifted. Strangers smiled more readily. A neighbor offered to help carry groceries. A colleague complimented my work in a way that made me stand a little taller. Nothing was dramatic or flashy, nothing that could be easily measured in bank statements or headlines, but the cumulative effect was palpable. I began to notice opportunities I had ignored before, ideas I had dismissed out of fear or self-doubt, doors I hadn't even realized were unlocked. I felt my intuition sharpening, my awareness stretching beyond the surface of things, and it became clear that the salt in that sacred corner was not magic in itself, but a catalyst, a mirror reflecting my intentions back at me in subtle, persistent ways. I started keeping a small journal, jotting down the tiny shifts I noticed each day, the calls, the emails, the chance encounters, and it felt almost like tracking the heartbeat of possibility. Some days the changes were so slight, I almost overlooked them. An unexpected tip at the coffee shop, a parking space appearing when I needed it most, a phone call from someone offering a small gesture of kindness. And yet, when I reviewed my notes, the pattern emerged, undeniable and encouraging, whispering to me that this quiet attention, this act of care and intention, was stirring forces beyond my immediate understanding. I realized that the act of observing, of noticing, of acknowledging these small miracles was just as important as placing the salt itself. My energy shifted subtly but steadily from anxious desperation to quiet expectation, and with that shift came clarity. I no longer felt trapped by circumstance, no longer weighed down entirely by the numbers on a screen or the deadlines on my calendar. Instead, I began to feel like a participant in a larger rhythm, a rhythm that responded to the care I poured into my home, my intentions, and myself. A rhythm that reminded me that change often arrives softly, in whispers and nudges, before it ever makes itself known in full. By the time the second week passed, I began to notice a rhythm to the changes, a quiet momentum that seemed to gather strength without fanfare, like a stream swelling gently before it becomes a river. It wasn't instantaneous wealth or a sudden windfall, but a sequence of small, undeniable shifts that made me sit up and take notice. A neighbor I barely knew appeared at my door one morning, holding an envelope with a project proposal they thought I might be interested in. And when I looked at them, there was a spark in their eyes, an unspoken acknowledgement that they had been waiting for the right person to come along. It was as if the universe had been nudging them toward me all this time, and now the timing was perfect. My heart raced with the realization that opportunity didn't always announce itself loudly. It sometimes arrived softly, with the gentlest of knocks. Then came the freelance work. Emails I had almost ignored found their way into my inbox with urgency I couldn't dismiss. Contracts I didn't even know existed landed on my desk, each one more promising than the last. The work was fulfilling, the pay more than reasonable, and for the first time I felt a thrill of independence I had only read about in books, a sense that the choices I made mattered, and that the universe wasn't just indifferent, it was responsive. I began to understand that the salt in that sacred corner wasn't a talisman that granted wealth by itself, but a signal, a way of aligning my focus, opening my awareness to doors I had previously been too distracted to notice, and in that alignment, momentum built. Everyday life began to feel like a series of affirmations, small confirmations that I was moving in the right direction. A friend referred me to someone who needed design work, and that person in turn connected me to another client. And suddenly I realized the threads were weaving together in ways that seemed almost orchestrated, like a pattern I couldn't yet see but could sense with my intuition. I felt a growing confidence in myself, a quiet knowledge that each step I took, each tiny act of attention, was contributing to something larger, something beyond my previous understanding of effort and reward. Even mundane tasks started to carry significance. I would water my plants and notice how they seemed greener, how the sunlight caught their leaves at just the right angle. I would rearrange the corner, moving the bowl of salt slightly, wiping away dust that had gathered overnight, and feel a surge of calm and focus, as if my intention itself was being reinforced. The energy in my home felt different now, lighter, more expansive, more awake, and I began to see how much my surroundings shaped my mind. The subtle changes had become a cascade. Opportunities, attention, and energy seemed to gather around me, building in ways I hadn't anticipated. Each morning, as I glanced at the corner where the salt rested, I felt a mixture of gratitude and anticipation, an understanding that this was not magic in the way fairy tales promised, but a profound interplay between intention, focus, and receptivity. I was learning to move with the rhythm of it, to notice the cues, to act when the doors opened, and to trust that this momentum, however quiet at first, was real and growing, guiding me toward possibilities I had long dismissed as impossible. Over time, I realized that the salt in that corner had become far more than a simple ritual. It had become a mirror reflecting my own intentions, a tangible reminder that what I believed about myself could shape the reality around me. Each morning I would approach that sacred corner almost reverently, taking a slow, deep breath before I even glanced at the bowl, and I began to notice how much my thoughts had shifted. Instead of waking with anxiety and calculation, my mind was now filled with quiet affirmations, reminders that I was capable, deserving, and open to abundance. I would whisper them aloud, sometimes softly, sometimes with a confidence I was still learning to trust, and with each repetition, a part of me that had been skeptical and fearful loosened its grip, allowing room for possibility I had once dismissed. I found myself observing everything with a new kind of attention. Conversations, emails, even casual encounters were filtered through this lens of intention. I noticed patterns that had gone unseen before, opportunities that had once slipped through my fingers now presenting themselves with subtle insistence. The salt became a focal point, a ritualized anchor that reminded me to pause, to align my energy with the life I wanted to cultivate. I rearranged the surrounding items, moved the candle to catch the morning light just so, and even adjusted the placement of a small potted plant so it seemed to lean toward the bowl, a small act that felt surprisingly symbolic, as if even the living things in my home were participating in this quiet ceremony. It wasn't about superstition anymore. It was about intentionality, about creating a space in my life where hope and effort could coexist. On days when I felt doubtful or distracted, I would return to that corner, letting my gaze rest on the simple crystals, reminding myself that wealth and opportunity weren't just about numbers, contracts, or luck. They were also about focus, attention, and the belief that I could receive what I needed. The act of tending to this ritual became meditative, almost like a conversation between myself and the universe, a quiet dialogue in which I was learning to listen as much as I spoke. I also began to notice a subtle transformation in how others responded to me. Clients approached with renewed trust. Friends recommended me without prompting, and even strangers seemed to engage with me more openly, as if the energy I was cultivating in my own home had begun to radiate outward. The salt, the corner, the rituals, they were catalysts, yes, but they were also teachers, reminding me that belief itself was an action and that ritual without attention and intention was hollow. Each day, as I refreshed the bowl, cleaned the surrounding space, and reaffirmed my intentions, I felt a growing sense of empowerment, a confidence that I was participating in the creation of my own path rather than simply reacting to circumstances. And in the quiet moments, when the apartment was still and the morning sun fell just right on the crystals, I felt a profound gratitude for this process, a recognition that the power I had been searching for externally had been quietly within me all along, waiting for a small act, a simple ritual, to awaken it, to remind me that belief, nurtured with care and consistency, could shape not only my home, but the very course of my life. I never imagined that something as simple as a bowl of salt in a quiet corner could change the way I moved through the world, could shift the weight of worry from my shoulders, could open doors I had long assumed were forever closed. And yet here I am, living proof that the smallest acts, executed with intention and belief, can ripple through life in ways we cannot predict, can summon possibilities that logic alone cannot explain, can awaken a power within us that we had forgotten, overlooked, or dismissed. It is not about luck. It is not about magic in the childish sense we often scoff at. It is about alignment, alignment of thought, of action, of intention, and of focus. And the way the universe responds when you dare to step into that alignment fully, without hesitation, without fear. I learned that abundance is not a distant dream. It is not a prize reserved for the extraordinary. It is not something you stumble upon by accident. It is a frequency, a vibration, a state of being that recognizes its own worth, commands attention, and insists on manifestation. When I placed that salt, when I honored the sacred corner, I was making a declaration, not just to the universe, but to myself, that I was ready, that I was worthy, that I would receive what I had longed for, not as a gift, not as a handout, but as the natural response to deliberate intention and consistent action. I watched opportunities materialize like whispers of promise that grew louder, like streams converging into rivers I had never noticed. And I understood in a visceral way that change rarely arrives in a single dramatic stroke. It comes in subtle shifts, in quiet nudges, in small confirmations that accumulate until the entire world seems to bend in your favor. There were moments when I doubted, moments when I thought it was coincidence, moments when the fear of disappointment crept in, but the ritual, the focus, the attention to that sacred space reminded me every single time that I was not powerless. I realized that what I had truly been seeking all along was belief, the unwavering, unshakable belief that I could claim what was meant for me, that I could step into abundance without shame or hesitation, that I could rewrite the story I had been telling myself about scarcity, struggle, and limitation. And now the rhythm of that corner, the subtle power of the salt, is interwoven with my life. It is a living testament to what happens when you act with purpose, when you create space for possibility, when you invite the unseen into your daily existence. It has taught me patience, attention, and reverence for the small acts that compound into extraordinary results. Every morning, I walk past that corner with gratitude and anticipation, watching the light play across the crystals, knowing that each movement, each intention, each moment of focus is a spark in the fire of creation that I am nurturing. I am no longer waiting for opportunity to knock. I am standing at the door, ready to receive, ready to recognize, ready to claim what has always been within reach, but hidden behind disbelief and inattention. And now I ask you to look around your own space, to feel the corners that catch your eye, to sense the places that call to you in the quiet of your mind, to wonder what might shift if you dared to honor them, if you dared to place something sacred there with intention, with belief, with unwavering focus. Think of the life you are capable of manifesting, the opportunities lying in wait, the abundance that is already responding to the energy you are willing to put into it. Imagine the subtle changes, the momentum, the quiet confirmations that could begin to reshape your days, your relationships, your work, your finances. Consider how it might feel to cultivate a space that doesn't just house you, but amplifies you, aligns you, and draws to you what you have longed for in silence. Now take a moment and ask yourself, if this simple act could awaken the possibility you have been craving, what would you do differently? Where would you place your focus? And how would you honor the intentions that matter most to you? The answer is already stirring inside you, waiting to be acknowledged. waiting to be acted upon, waiting to ripple outward in ways that will leave no corner of your life untouched. It is yours to claim if you have the courage, if you have the belief, if you are ready to recognize that abundance has been waiting for you all along,